All right, welcome back. I'm going to wrap up Chapter 3. So Section 3.1 was all about mitosis and the cell cycle, how the cell cycle is a period of growth, development, and then cell division at the end. We talked about the phases of mitosis, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and then it ends with cytokinesis, and we end up with two identical cells. So this final section of Chapter 3 looks at levels of organization. And so we're going to look at some differences between unicellular, which means one-celled organisms, and multicellular organisms, which means many. So we'll talk about how they're different. And then how do cells become specialized? So basically cell differentiation. So that's the process of how a skin cell becomes a skin cell, a neuron cell becomes a neuron cell, because when you think about it, you all started off as one cell. Egg plus sperm equals zygote, and that zygote went through multiple rounds of division, and then over time it took a pathway to end up the type of cell that makes up a certain part of your body. And so we have over 100 different types of cells inside our body, so it's actually a quite amazing process, really, really complex process, but we're just going to talk about what does it mean to differentiate. Okay, so let's talk about organization, okay, the levels of organization. So everything in the universe, is pretty much made up of atoms. If it takes up space and has volume, it matters. So you take up space, you have volume, you matter, right? And so these atoms can combine in various ways to form molecules, and we talked about macromolecules way back in Chapter 2, carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. And when you take those macromolecules, or just molecules, they eventually make up cells, and that's the building block of life, right? That statement from the cell theory. Cells are the basic unit of life. And so in multicellular organisms, different cells, they kind of have to work together to carry out specific functions. So here's a nice diagram just showing the levels of structural organization, starting off with an atom to a molecule. There's that macromolecule that I mentioned earlier. Organelles, okay, organelles, you see the word organ, so it's like an organ for the cell. A bunch of similar cells together make up the tissue. Groups of tissues make up an organ. Different organs working together, you get an organ system, and then multiple organ systems working together, you end up finally with an organism. Okay, so first off, let's talk about unicellular versus multicellular. So unicellular means that they are one-celled, and because they are one-celled, that one cell has to carry out all the functions necessary to live. So within that one cell, it's got to have something to get rid of waste products. It's got to have something to make proteins. It's got to have something to create energy. It's got to have something to kind of direct all of these activities. So everything that cell needs is in that one cell. And it allows it to respond to its environment, to get rid of the waste, to grow, and to reproduce. This, does include prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Unicellular means it's one-celled. We have one-celled prokaryotic organisms. We have one-celled eukaryotes, or eukaryotic organisms. So just know that if an organism is one, just made up of one cell, like a paramecium or an amoeba, which you might find at the bottom of a lake bed, bacteria, or even yeast, they're all made up of one celled, and within them they carry out, or they have everything they need to carry out processes of life. So we've discussed prokaryotes and eukaryotes in the past, and told you pro rhymes with no. Remember, they don't have no nucleus. Okay, pro rhymes with no nucleus. So they don't have a membrane around their genetic material. That's their nucleus, and they are significantly smaller than eukaryotes. In fact, like 10 prokaryotes might equal one eukaryote. Eukaryotes, euc rhymes with a nucleus, and they also have tiny little organs called organelles within them. So here I have a picture of a prokaryotic cell, aka bacteria. You can see that there's no nucleus. The DNA is within the cytoplasm. Over here I have a eukaryotic cell, and you can see we have a nucleus and many, 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 many different organelles in it. Now, multicellular organisms are made up of many cells, and all of those cells work together to carry out a specific job. Some of them do have organelles, but the main thing is thinking about the organism as a whole. So there's a process that occurs in multicellular organisms called cell differentiation. So the process by which cells become different types of cells. And different types of cells use different parts of instructions found on chromosomes. To me, this is mind-blowing, this next statement. Every single cell inside your body basically has the same DNA. Okay, so you have 46 chromosomes. Every single cell has the same DNA. But they only read certain parts of that DNA to become the cell that they are. So skin cells, they're reading like a certain, gene, and a muscle cell, is coding or reading a different gene. So you can kind of think of your DNA as like a recipe book. It's just filled with all these different recipes, and the recipes are basically the different cell types. So stem cells are cells that are unspecialized, which means that they are not a specific cell that carries out a special job. Okay, the stem cell has the ability to become any type of cell inside that organism. So unspecialized cells that are able to develop into many different cell types. So in animals, we call them stem cells. Okay, in plants, we call them meristems. And we find meristems in the tips of the roots and the stems. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about these white pines that my husband planted for me. So when I lived out on Redpath, my favorite tree is the white pine. I think I probably said red pine earlier. I meant to say white pine. The needles are super, super soft. They're in bundles of 5. I just love white pines. So my husband planted 5 white pines for me. Now, living out in the country, you have to worry about deer. So I took care of these babies. I covered them up with the tips, like the very, very tops of the white pines with paper, and stapled it so that the deer wouldn't nibble the meristem off the top, because otherwise the tree wouldn't grow any taller. So there's these meristems found at the tips of the roots and the stems, and there's lateral meristems so it can grow wider, and there's vertical meristems, that's not the correct terminology, apical meristems that allow it to grow vertically. So I didn't want short, fat white pines. I want beautiful, tall white pines. So I took care of these babies to make sure that their meristems weren't eaten off. Fast forward a couple years later, still at Redpath, the paper on one of them had degraded, and I forgot to cover it. I didn't notice it, and the deer nibbled the top off of it. And so now when I drive by my old place, I don't live there anymore, you can see tall white pines, and then there's that one short one because the apical meristem was bitten off. So protect your meristems. Okay, so here's a diagram just showing a stem cell, how a single cell can replicate more. So stem cells can make more stem cells, or it can differentiate into many different cell types, like neuron cells, red blood cells, fat cells, I don't know, those look like cheek cells, epithelial cells. And so that's what this diagram is showing. This is showing how you all started off as one cell, egg and sperm meet, and we have a fertilized egg that goes through multiple rounds of mitosis. But it does set aside some cells called stem cells, and they're colored here in blue. And these stem cells are the ones that differentiate and become different types of cells that eventually make up you, all the different types of organs inside of your body. This is a diagram showing meristems found throughout the plant. So you do have apical meristems or shoot meristems that grow vertically, and you also have lateral meristems that grow laterally, that gives the plant girth, and then you also have root apical meristems, so it can grow deep into the soil. So yeah. All right, going back to levels of organization. So I touched on this on the first slide of the lecture. So starting with the smallest, and this is the level of organization that you're going to need to know. It's going to be cells. And then when you get multiple cells working together, groups of similar cells working together, you create a tissue. And then when you have, well, let me talk about the different tissues. So these tissues in us, there's 4 different types of tissues in animals. You have muscle tissue, connective tissue, that's kind of like blood vessels or epithelial skin. You have nervous tissue, so, neurons. And then epithelial. Oh, I thought that was, no, epithelial, which is skin, muscle. Connective is like it connects it. So cartilage, tendons, bones. Sorry, I messed that one up. Okay, so here are the 4 types of tissues down here. Here's my connective, there's my epithelial, there's the muscle, and there's the nervous. Plants have 3 different types of tissues: dermal, vascular, and ground. And so the dermal is the outer layer. It's kind of like the cell wall. And then the ground is kind of like everything inside of it. And vascular is for transportation, the movement of water and sugars throughout the plant. Okay, so cells is the smallest. Groups of cells working together create tissues. Tissues make up organs. So when you have different tissues, like muscle tissue, where are you? Muscle tissue. We have connective tissue, nervous tissue, and these that's epithelial, and this is connective. When they all work together, then you create an organ. So it has to consist of all types of tissues. Like for the stomach, it's got all 4, and you can see that down here. For a leaf is an organ of a plant cell. It has vascular tissue, dermal tissue, and ground tissue within that organ. So organs need to have all types of tissues in them to be considered an organ. All right, so once you have a bunch of organs and all of a sudden different organs are working together to create a series of tasks, then you end up with an organ system. So just think about your digestive system and all the different organs that work together. So, when you eat your food, you have your mouth, your tongue, your teeth, okay, and it goes down the esophagus to the stomach, and then it goes from the small intestine to the large intestine. But then, you're extracting water and waste. You have blood vessels, you got your urinary system working there. So you can see we have, within just the digestive system, it's interacting with other systems. So just keep that in mind. So organ systems, different organs working together to carry out a task. Plants, they have 2 types of organ systems. It's either a root system, which means like the roots are growing underneath, okay, and they're absorbing water. Or you have a shoot system where the plants grow vertically or horizontally, depending on the species, and then they are creating sugars. So root or shoot system. And then finally the organism. And the organism is the multiple organ systems working together. So just starting with cells, tissue, it skips organ here. Organ system, and then organism. Sorry, there we go. So that does it for 3.2.